Moving on, agenda item number 7, update on the status of the desert tortoise. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Las Vegas Assistant Field Supervisor Michael Senn. Informational update on the status of desert tortoise in southern Nevada will be provided, including current information on pet desert tortoise issues.
Mr. Chairman and Commission members, good morning. I'd like to thank you as a person who spent 23 years in a previous life with the State Fish and Wildlife Agency. I know how difficult your job is and the commitment it takes, so I appreciate your time and your service for that. And also thank you for letting us take the time to give you a real quick update on some of the changes that we're making to management of the Desert Tortoise Program. And it's a little different twist of the program. It really relates to how do we manage pet tortoises, really, and it's an issue here in southern Nevada. But it's really given us an opportunity to look at that program a lot harder and move some of those resources we used to spend on that program into conservation and recovery, which is where we really want to be. So with that, let me move on. As you can kind of see on the first slide there, sometimes in life you're headed down a road and you realize maybe that's not the best road to be on, and it's time to move. And about 2 years ago, that's really where we found ourselves with this program. We saw funding resources were really beginning to dwindle. The problem was really becoming larger than any of the agencies could handle on their own or even collectively, and it really provided us an opportunity to really make an assessment of what is this program doing, what does it really serve, what are the benefits, and how do we change this program so that we can manage this issue, but somehow use those resources better for the long-term conservation and recovery of the desert tortoise. A little background on desert tortoise. Looking at the audience, I think most of the folks were probably around here when the Mojave population of the desert tortoise was listed. If you look at the map on the screen, the dark area, of course, is the Mojave population. The area below the Colorado River is the Sonoran population. That is not listed, but is a candidate. The tortoise Mojave population was originally listed in 1989 through an emergency listing as endangered. A year later, it was basically downlisted to threatened status, and that's the status that it currently has. I think most folks, if they have any familiarity at all with Nevada, realize kind of what happened when the tortoise was listed and the impacts that had, and how we've worked, hopefully, to try and avoid some of those impacts. So in 1994, we completed the first critical habitat and recovery plan. That plan was recently revised in 2011. That's the current plan we're operating on. And in 2012, as part of that recovery plan, we formed what are called RITs, or Recovery Implementation Teams. Those are active right now, and one of the main reasons that we formed the RITs is we're really trying to develop on-the-ground conservation actions within the different recovery units for the tortoise, so that when we have projects or when we have funds and resources that we can put into tortoise conservation, we're putting those conservation dollars back out onto the ground. Brief history on the pet tortoise issue. We had what's called the DTCC, or the Desert Tortoise Conservation Center, that was constructed in 1990. And that was really due to the Las Vegas Suit Settlement Agreement that basically enabled the greater Las Vegas metropolitan area to initiate or reinitiate construction, which had come to a kind of screeching halt. Also, part of that was the Clark County MSHCP, or the Multi-Species Habitat Conservation Plan. Clark County currently operates under that, and it really operated at the tent was developed to intake wild tortoises, and there were wild tortoises that were being removed from construction sites so that construction could move forward, and that was the original purpose for the Tortoise Center. In 1996, that was changed, and what happened in 1996 and why that changed is there was at that time a disease that became what they thought was more prevalent, or at least became known in the wild population of tortoises, called ERTS, or it's upper respiratory tract infection, and that was thought to be a substantial threat to tortoise populations. And so at that time, they didn't want folks that had pet tortoises, which can carry that disease, to be released out into the wild populations and transmit those diseases to wild populations. And so the practice was really changed from just picking up wild tortoises to now also dealing with pet tortoises. And when construction started and Las Vegas was in the height of its boom, there was a lot of folks that were picking up tortoises or had pet tortoises that they had acquired to listing the tortoise, which was okay, it was legal. And all of a sudden they decided, well, this tortoise is a long-lived species, it might live 50 years, might live longer than me. I really don't want this tortoise anymore. And what do they do with it now? They weren't able to release them back into the wild, and so this pet tortoise service was started. So that went along for a while. In 2009, Clark County had the foresight to basically say, this really isn't a wise use of our resources to deal with and manage pet tortoises. And I think in hindsight, I think everybody can kind of look back on that now and say, you know, that was probably a very good decision and a smart way to go. And it did cut a lot of the financial support that we had going to the center at that time, which was going through the multi-species habitat conservation plan. And it really forced a reassessment of the priorities for the mission of that center. And so in 2010, the service changed the mission of that center to a conservation and recovery focus, and I'm going to touch on that just a bit more later. So how many unwanted pet tortoises do we have, and really what is the nature of that problem? Up until about May of this year, we had approximately 1,000 pet tortoises coming into the center per year. And as I mentioned before, they're a very long-lived species, and there was a lot of money and time and being invested and resources being invested basically to care for pet tortoises, many of which were not releasable back out into the wild as wild transplants. As I mentioned, of those 1,000, about only half of them really were suitable to go back out into the wild populations after a health assessment or screening. That's really due to the disease concerns. We don't want to transmit diseases from pet tortoises into the wild population. We have about 2,400 tortoises currently at the center, that's as of today. And May 1st, we really started going a lot stronger down this path of trying to deal with the issue. And at that time, there was a pickup service. So if somebody would call the center, they would send somebody out to pick up their pet tortoise. In May, that was changed basically from a will call or call us, we'll come get your tortoise, to a weekly service. And so that they would basically log those phone calls and then they go pick them up in a week. And even just that action alone reduced the number of tortoises we had coming into the center by 60%. Now, we haven't gone a whole year, but we've been in a pretty, the summer months and the spring and fall are the months when tortoises are most active. So we think that just that action alone has done a pretty good job of help reducing the number of tortoises coming into the center. So why are pre-act tortoises an issue, or why are pet tortoises an issue? The tortoises, as I mentioned before, that were possessed or owned prior to them being listed as an endangered or a threatened species are legal to have. They're legal for folks to possess. However, their progeny, the tortoises that are born, are actually not legal, but it's not illegal either. It's kind of a gray area, but it's possession of tortoises that are basically hatched when they're in captivity are not illegal to possess. What makes it illegal is when someone goes to try and give that tortoise or transfer that tortoise to another person and they don't have the proper paperwork. So we realized that was an issue, and so that was one of the reasons you'll see one of the actions that we took is trying to address this issue of how do we make it easier for folks to be able to transfer tortoises from one person to another. So in state law, there's a requirement that it requires Fish and Wildlife Service approval for tortoises to be adopted out for someone else, and these are the pre-act tortoises. Really, because they're not, pre-act tortoises are technically not Fish and Wildlife property, they're really wildlife for the state, they're state property. And in 1991, by the Tortoise Group, there was an adoption program that was started, as you can see at that time, and that's been pretty much the same, or it's been not much above that. It's only roughly resulted in about 10 tortoise adoptions per year, and it was a pretty onerous process, a long process, and so we knew we needed to change that. So this past year, we've been working with the Tortoise Group to develop an online adoption program. We think that will make it a lot easier. Folks can get on there. They basically can print off the paperwork, kind of do a self-certification, or have someone from the Tortoise Group basically come out, look at their yard, give them tips on how to make their yard tortoise friendly, and somebody can basically then go ahead and give that tortoise that they don't want to someone else that may want it. So the other big part of that is we're developing an MOU. It's not quite finalized with the Animal Foundation or Lead Animal Shelter, where we will move away from being a tortoise pickup service completely. It will become a drop-off service. So if folks no longer want their tortoises, they'll have a couple of options. They can either look to try and adopt that tortoise to somebody else if they know someone that wants it, or they can drop it off at Lead and we will try and adopt that tortoise back out. The tortoises that can't be adopted back out obviously will need to go back out back out to the Tortoise Center. So where does that leave us for the future? As I mentioned before, one of our main goals was really to use the limited resources that we have for listing or for managing listed species and use them very wise. It wasn't long ago our regional director was in town and he made a presentation to us, and he did the math on the number of listed species that we have. I believe it's, and when we did the math on the number of dollars available for listed species and the number of dollars per listed species comes out to about $9,000 per year for each listed species that the Fish and Wildlife Service gets to try and recover species. Now, obviously that's not an even allocation. High-profile species like the tortoise do get more money, but it gives you a feel for the amount of resources, the pretty minimal resources that the service gets annually to try and recover and manage listed species. So the tortoise mission is really moving towards conservation and recovery. One of the main focuses is the health screenings that we need to try and move tortoises out. Conservation research basically for that program. Training as far as trying to train biologists to basically do surveys, and then public research efforts. So the other goal that we've had with the changes in program is really to introduce or reduce the intake that we have to less than 500 tortoises per year. That seems like a pretty attainable goal. And if we get that, some of the things that we've done to get there is, like I mentioned, move from that pickup to a drop-off service, make those adoptions and transfers easier, and then you'll see Chris Tomlinson will present later an NDOW regulation change that will limit folks to 1 tortoise per person and household, and that there be no contact between tortoises to try and minimize the basically amount of breeding that we have. So we're trying to get the number of tortoises that we can translocate, or the number we take in, equal to the number that we can translocate out also. And we've worked cooperatively with the state and BLM to develop a translocation and population augmentation program that's enhanced, and we recently finished basically the environmental assessment for that. And actually today is the first population of tortoises that we're moving out onto one of the range around town from this new program. So with all those tools, hopefully it would give us a better way to move forward and allow us to focus those limited resources on recovery. And with that, I appreciate your time and be happy to answer any questions.
Anybody have any questions? Commissioner Drew?
I just have one, and I appreciated the presentation. I'm assuming that the service has worked with NDOW in development of the regulation and is in support.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Drew, that's correct.
Commissioner Rain?
Just briefly, just find it interesting. Now we have too much breeding of tortoises, and that's a problem. It just seems almost ironic considering everything else we've been seeing. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Rain, I'm not sure how to answer that. We understand that. That's why we're trying to limit the number of pet tortoises, because the biggest issue is there's concerns if you try and move pet tortoises out to wild populations. Some of them, as we mentioned, if they go through a proper health screening, we know they're free from disease. If they're genetically compatible, we know we can move them out into the wild populations, and we're trying to do that and use these tortoises for that purpose. But not all those tortoises can we do that, unfortunately. But we do want to use the ones that we can.
I have a few questions. Range-wide, how many tortoises are there?
Oh, Mr. Chairman, I was afraid you might ask that. I don't know that we have a really good figure on that. I'm not sure I really want to throw an estimate out there, but I'd be happy to get that number back to you folks.
And then I've heard numbers that it's kind of funny, you have a threatened species that there's over 100,000 in captivity in one valley in Nevada. It seems kind of contradictory to have an endangered species that there's 100,000 in captivity. Is that 100,000 a well-inflated number, or is that an accurate number? Where, do you know how many are in captivity in Las Vegas?
Mr. Chairman, are you speaking captive within people's homes?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's anybody's best guess how many we have. I mean, we know how many we have at the Tortoise Center, and that's about 2,700. How many are captive as far as people's pets? I think that's anybody's best guess, to be very frank.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Commissioner Milroy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The question I have is, what is your goal? What's U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service goal for that population? Is it to get it off the threatened list, or maintenance, or where do you plan on going from here? If you plan on controlling the breeding or so-called overbreeding?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Maury, are you speaking to the wild population or the captive populations?
You stated that some of the captive population is suitable for release. And so it seems like to me that the question in my mind is, why are we trying to put that, why are we trying to damper that, if that is an option to eventually get the species off of the threatened list?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Maury, it's unfortunately, like most issues in wildlife, it's not that simple of just being able to put tortoises out on the landscape and then we'd be able to delist or downlist the species. We can use them these tortoises to augment populations where the populations are below what we would consider what the available habitat can support. But a lot of tortoise recovery this is one tool, but that's just one small tool in the tool bag. And most of what we need to recover or conserve tortoises is really to try and reduce the threats on the landscape throughout the tortoise habitat. And so I think right now we have an abundance of tortoises in the Tortoise Center. Our goal is to get that number at the Tortoise Center below 400 animals, and then we might only have a few a year that we are available for that. Once we get this big bulk out, I know in speaking to our head of our recovery center is, I don't know that there's going to be a huge use for these tortoises. It would be kind of analogous to where you might have a ailing deer herd, but the habitat is not in good condition. You haven't done anything to recover that. Is simply throwing more deer on top of there. All they would do is probably eat themselves out of house and home. And you have a similar situation with the tortoise. There are still threats on the landscape, and yet our ultimate goal, yes, like all listed species, we'd love to see them either delisted or downlisted and taken off the endangered species list, because we have a lot greater flexibility in the management of those species at that point. And we can get a lot more assistance, hopefully, from folks like Director Mayer and his staff. But like I said, this is not a long-term solution or the only tool that we have to, and it won't alone recover the tortoise.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
That finishes up item number 7. Before we move on to 8, we're going to